Hi, here we are once again for reading from Barak's book 5. Tonight we're going to start with chapter 216, which is Act 2, chapter 16. And depending on enthusiasm and how long Barak can talk, we're going to see how far we can go. Barak?
Thanks, Greg. So we're going to do a new method tonight, which is the Shireen method. Thank you, Shireen, for that. Which is we are going to read straight through without the pauses between chapters for conversation. We left our heroes last time on their way back to Lava Town. Only two of them, Nael and Lomek. The other three were arrested while in Corantha City and taken back to Lava Town by the Lava Town militia, police, and they also got attacked by a werewolf and found the talisman that apparently that Aiden has been searching for. I think that's the theory you proposed, which is probably true. They are now back in Lava Town, and that's when we're going to start this next chapter, which is called, it's Act 2, Chapter 16, called The Church of Tranquility. Other thing, these chapters, at least a couple of them, have the rapid switching between scenes. So I'm going to use these pauses to kind of like indicate that's going to happen. There's going to be a little bit of back and forth. So I'm going to use like meaningful, loaded pauses to indicate those each time. All right. So Act 2, Chapter 16, Church of Tranquility. They got back into Lava Town late the following evening, but instead of heading back down to the shallows, they went on to Trade Bay. Even at this hour, the top platform was busy with constant movement of people and goods. After asking for directions with a caravan that was still unloading, they made their way to one of the small offices on the lower platform. The sign on the front door pronounced that it was the headquarters of the Lava Flow Merchant Company. It belonged, they knew, to Garrett's family. The office seemed quiet, but the door was slightly ajar and light shone through, and they stepped inside. A young gnome was sitting at the desk, poring over a ledger. As they entered, she said without raising her head, "It's too late. Come back tomorrow." Lomek cleared his throat. "We're here about Garrett," he said, sounding far more confident than he felt. The gnome raised her head and looked at them. "Garrett?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. She looked like a teenager. They smiled and nodded. A few seconds passed in silence. "You've got the wrong place," she said, and lowered her head back to work. Lomek, in a tone so gentle and empathetic that Nael could sense its healing power, asked, "Man, your hand is shaking all of a sudden. We're his friends, and we want to find him. Please, can you help us?" The gnome didn't respond, but her shoulders started rocking slightly. They waited patiently. After a moment, she raised her head towards them, tears coming down her cheeks, and with her voice breaking, she explained, "They're going to kill my brother." Sobbing as she spoke, Helena, as the gnome was called, explained to them that the family had learned of Garrett's arrest, subsequent tribunal, and death sentence for being involved in some horrible plot on that very morning. Even though Garrett was estranged from the family, her parents apparently cared enough to appeal the verdict. She told them that Garrett was her older brother, and she had missed him dearly after he was tossed out of their home. Was her parents' appeal likely to succeed? They inquired, but Helena didn't know. They inquired about Solace and Aiden, but Helena knew nothing about them either. Garrett would never murder anyone, she insisted several times throughout her diatribe. They sat with her for a little while, recalling Garrett's quirky sense of humor and how he could always lift the mood and make light of difficult moments. Eventually, she calmed down after Lomek held her for a little while, his embrace calming and his voice soothing. Just before they left, she looked up at him, her face filled with wonder. "Are you really his friend?" she asked. When he nodded his assent, she said with a small childlike voice, "I'm glad." It was such a tender moment that Nael thought her heart might burst. After discussing their options, they decided to make their way down to the Steadfast Inn and look for Brad in the morning. As they walked into the common room, they were struck by how full and lively it was. It felt like a different world to them now. Sailors and visiting merchants were mixing in with locals, exchanging tall tales, making deals, and issuing threats. A bard on stage was playing a lute and singing. Her song was good, but nothing exceptional. Nael listened for a bit. The bard was skilled, but lacking in confidence, and she kept making small mistakes. Worse, the bard evidently recognized her mistakes and they frustrated her, which further hurt her performance. Nael couldn't help herself. With newfound recognition of her own expanded abilities, she made the performance melodies just a bit more dramatic and enchanting, the delivery more meaningful. The bar audience, most of whom were ignoring the music, grew quiet as the enlivened song caught their attention. The bard noticed it too, and Nael could see the surprise and delight in her eyes. After a moment, the bard seized on it, feeding on the energy in the room, and her confidence grew. Her performance began to genuinely improve, and in a little while, Nael stopped manipulating the sounds and just enjoyed the show. Many more coins were making their way into the bard's hat. Much better, Nael thought, and smiled. She will eat well tonight. She also noted to herself with satisfaction that she could now manipulate sounds for an entire crowd at once. Lomek nudged her elbow. Enjoying the show? He asked. Nael nodded. Did you have anything at all to do with the song getting better? Nael winked at him. A girl can't spill all her secrets, she grinned. Well, I have bad news. Trina said the inn is full, no room. So what are we going to do? Nael asked. I figured we could go to the church if you're okay with that, Lomek hesitated. Plus, I'd love to ask my dad about some things Grinta said. He looked up at her. He's a good guy, I promise. He sounds like a bloody saint, Nael laughed. Sure, lead the way, Lomek. I'm honestly curious to meet him. When they got there, Rajiv was in the middle of feeding some 30 homeless from the streets of the Shallows. His wizened face lit up when he saw them, but he didn't stop serving until everyone in line had a bowl of soup and a chunk of bread. Then he turned to them and hugged Lomek deeply and affectionately, in a warm embrace that, watching from the side, stirred a deep feeling of belonging in Nael. She didn't have to wait long to satisfy it either. After he was done with his son, he offered her his arms, and she found herself nodding her assent sheepishly, as if she were much younger. His hug was transcendental. She found herself melting into his arms, feeling safer and more loved than ever before in her life. She felt a little sad when it ended, but then she saw his smile and found herself comforted and happy. She looked at Lomek again, with a new appreciation of his unusual nature. No wonder he can touch people the way he does, she thought. What a blessing to grow up this way. Lomek gave his father his own share of their gold and told the tale of their adventure over dinner. Nael noticed that he kept vague the details of the robbery and their meeting with Zafina. Rajiv was focused and present, only rarely asking for minor clarifications. After Lomek concluded, he sat back in his chair and looked at the both of them. Quite a story there, son, he said. He looked at Nael. What about you, young lady? Anything you'd like to add? She felt like she would do anything to please him, tell him anything he wanted to know, but her mind was blank, so she just shook her head instead. Lomek spoke. So, Dad, we never talked about this before, but can you tell me where I'm from? Rajiv smiled. The Sentia, apparently, he chuckled. Honestly, son, does it really matter? I found you here, in Lavatown. Yes, Dad, it does matter. It matters to me now. I need to know, Lomek insisted. Rajiv poured himself a bit more ale from the pitcher. Well, son, the truth is, I found you on the little strip of coast by the gash. There was a big storm, and you know how I sometimes like to go look for survivors afterwards, just in case. Lomek nodded. Yes, we've gone there together a few times. That's how I came to like the smell of the storm. His hand rose automatically to touch the symbol of Thor on his chest. Rajiv took a sip. Indeed, he said. So after a storm, I went there, and there you were, lying on the beach, a small, unconscious child. Certainly not a sight I would have ever expected to see, especially considering how dwarves are notorious for hating boats. He took a deep breath. I took it as a sign from Frey, a test of sorts. She's rather fond of dwarves, you know. I figured perhaps she wanted to see if I was up to the task. I believed it all the way until... Until what? Nael heard herself asking breathlessly. Until Thor adopted him from me, Rajiv answered. She took another sip. And took another sip. She could detect in his voice a slight edge of pain. Lomek grabbed his father's hand and held it. You know I love Frey, Daddy. Who knows the ways of the gods? Maybe they agreed on it together, he said. Rajiv laughed. That's a lot of planning for two gods to do over one little dwarf, don't you think? Anyway, what does it matter? You're my son, and I love you with all my heart, and I think you're perfect. So, what are you going to do about your missing friends? They looked at each other and shrugged their shoulders. We have no idea, Lomek said. Didn't you say you were working for the guild now? Surely they could help. Not exactly working for them, Lomek said, looking embarrassed. No? Rajiv gestured at the small pile of gold coins on the table. So tell me again where these came from? Lomek lowered his eyes uncomfortably. Nael could swear that he blushed, even if she couldn't quite see it. It's all right, son. You have to find your own way. And in all fairness, your tales of the big city intrigue me. Speaking of which, how do you know Frent? And more importantly, how does he know Mek? Nael piped in. Rajiv looked at her. Right, yes. I hadn't seen him in a long while. We used to be pretty good friends before he got promoted and moved to the city. He actually helped me and my Gilda set up the church back in the day. Good man, very kind. He turned back to Lomek. Anyway, the year I found you was his last one here. He actually spent some time minding you, son. I'm a little surprised that you don't remember him, but in truth, you were deeply traumatized and it took for you a while for you to recover. You often behaved like a toddler during those first few months. Lomek sat up suddenly. Wait, Frent was Uncle B? He looked so different. Yes, Rajiv laughed. His name is actually Bernelius Frentenga. Nael raised her eyebrows at the unusual moniker, heir to the Frent runner fortune. They're an important trading company with a seat at the big table. I guess he changed his appearance and is using a nickname. His younger brother, Albergino, was very recently promoted as well, and is now first aide to Arpo at Lavatown. Nael and Lomek exchanged a furtive glance. What's going on? Rajiv asked. Lomek stated, oh boy. He muttered, Dad, will you promise you won't get mad at me? Rajiv crossed his hands on the table. Go on, son, he said in a firm but kind voice. You know that office I told you about? The one where the guild handler, Brad, told us to go look for information? That was the office of the Popade, Lomek said, looking increasingly miserable. Nael watched as Rajiv absorbed this bit of information, wondering what would happen next. To her utter amazement, he started laughing uproariously. She looked at Lomek, who was so startled that she couldn't help but laugh as well. Of all the people in the world, my sweet, generous, loving, clueless son goes and robs the one person in this town that's in charge of helping me run this place. Rajiv raised his glass before draining it. By her grace and wisdom, I sure do hope he never finds out. A few minutes later, as they were getting ready to retire to bed, Lomek spoke up again. Dad, can I show you something? Sure, son. Is it another surprise? I swear I haven't had such a jovial evening in a very long time, Rajiv responded, grinning. Lomek pulled out a folded piece of paper from inside his tunic. Dad, do you remember the elven woman that we helped last year? Rajiv thought for a moment. Yes, I think so. You picked her up on your way back from the beach when you got your calling, right? Yes, her. So when we were getting evidence out of the Popade's office, I also got this, well, I don't know what it is exactly. It's like a painting, but doesn't actually feel like one. It looks extremely realistic. He handed her portrait to his father, who unfolded it. I think it's her, right? And is that Frent's brother with her? I think it's some sort of family portrait. Rajiv examined the picture and then nodded. Yes, while I haven't met him yet in person, I do believe that's Albergino Frentenga. And this sure does look like that lady we hosted. She's probably his wife. Didn't you say earlier that she invited you to that meeting with the guild? He handed the paper back to Lomek. Can I see? Nael asked. Lomek passed the paper to her and she unfolded it. She gasped and her hand flew to her mouth. What's wrong? Rajiv and Lomek asked in unison. Nael's face was drained of color and her eyes were full of tears. She opened her mouth, closed it, and swallowed hard. She opened it again, but no words came out. Rajiv leaned forward across the table and held her shaking hand, which seemed to reassure her. She took a deep breath. That's my mom, she whispered, almost inaudibly. Lomek stared at her in shock. Your mother is married to Popade? Didn't she die in the fire? Act 2, Chapter 17, Revelations 3:2. It took several minutes for Nael to tell her story. So that's what happened, she finished. I never found my mom after that. So many people died that night. Do you remember? Rajiv nodded. If she lived, there's no way she wouldn't have found me. Her voice broke again. She felt Rajiv squeezing her hand. Or at least that's what I thought, she smiled ruefully. When my boy here found her in the tunnels a few months ago, she was searching for something, Rajiv said. Perhaps she was still searching for you? Wait, did she tell you anything? Nael's eyes darted back and forth between father and son. No, she spoke very little, Rajiv shook his head. But after she recovered, she seemed very intent. It was clear that she was trying to find something or someone. Upper shelvers don't come down here unless they have a good reason. Anyway, now that you know, you should be able to find her and ask her yourself. Nael shook her head slowly. I'm not sure if I want to now, she said cautiously. Rajiv smiled. I understand. Why don't you sleep on it? See how you feel in the morning. He turned to Lomek. Son, why don't you go and set up an extra bunk? I'll show your friend around the church for a bit. Lomek nodded and left the room. Rajiv looked back at Nael. So, does he know? He asked softly. Know what? How you feel about him, Rajiv said. Nael could feel her face flushing. What do you mean? She stammered. Funny thing about us humans, some of us can become pretty observant. We get more of our short lives that way, learning things more quickly, Rajiv winked. Running his fingers through his white hair, he said, I've been around for a fair bit, you know. That wasn't hard to figure out. Nael stared at him in wonder. I wish he was my dad, she found herself thinking involuntarily. It's all right. But you have to understand, he's very, very young, practically still a child. I don't think he fully grasps that I am not too much longer for this world either. He is dwarven, after all, even if I raised him as my own. Rajiv sighed softly. I sometimes think he assumes he'll live as long as he will. In truth, he will be orphaned again, and fairly soon. Nael was feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Are you sick? She asked. Oh, no, child, not at all, he laughed. Except with the disease of aging, which we cannot avoid. He stopped and examined her face. Wait, why did you react that way? He inquired. Nael was caught by surprise. I never told this to anyone, she said, then covered her mouth with her hand. Somehow, in Rajiv's presence, she found it impossible to hold back her terrible secret, the one she'd kept from everyone else in her life. Do you wish to tell me? She took a deep breath and let herself feel the warmth of his hand again. I suppose so, she paused and swallowed. I'm going to die soon, too. I'm aging too fast, she blurted. How old are you? Rajiv asked. 109, she responded. Still but a child, he murmured. But you look older than that for an elf. She nodded helplessly. He leaned forward and looked at her intently. Perhaps you are not elven? Nael felt herself jerk with the shock of sudden recognition. He held her hand tightly, and after a moment, she felt the tension slip away. Would you like me to find out for sure? He asked. I am a diviner. Freyg has given me the ability to see some things for what they truly are. She nodded weakly. Rajiv moved his chair closer, then placed his hands over her shoulders without touching them. His lips started moving, and she realized that he was praying. In her peripheral vision, she caught a glimpse of a faint golden aura that had appeared, and glancing downwards, she saw that it covered his arms. She lost her sense of time as serenity overcame her. She felt her body relax in submission and surrendered to the feeling. Just as I thought, she heard him say sometime later. Opening her eyes slowly, she saw him sitting upright in his chair. You are indeed only part elven, part human, and you are therefore aging normally. Indeed, I should say that you seem extremely healthy for your age. You might even live as long as some dwarves. Nael couldn't find her tongue and simply nodded. The woman in the portrait, your mother, you say she was fully elven? Yes, she replied softly, no doubt about it. Then there is the mystery of who your father was. From our conversation, am I to understand that you never knew him? Nael shook her head. She was dumbfounded by the revelations. She scrambled to make sense of her emotions, and her mind worked feverishly to reframe the context of her life. Did your mother ever tell you anything about him? Rajiv sat back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. This simple question and Rajiv's gentle manner brought her back to the present. She thought about it for a while, trying to reach as far back into her childhood as she could. Not much, she heard herself saying. She told me he was a visiting elf, someone she fell madly in love with, and he left before she even knew she was carrying me. Now that we're talking about it, I get how silly it sounds, because that's not how elves are, but Mom was different. I realize now that she never told me much about him at all. It just didn't really seem to matter, and Yoros, my adoptive father, was so nice. She raised her face towards him. I tried to find my real father, spent a few years, but discovered no clues. Rajiv smiled reassuringly. It seems like you were looking for the wrong person. Interlude. Lomek remembers. Lomek drifts off to sleep in his old bed, finding the sound of Nael's quiet breathing from across the room to be oddly comforting. It's good to be home. His mind begins to wander. He finds himself at the ocean shore. It's a beautiful day and the beach is quiet. He breathes in the ocean air deeply and realizes why he is the only one there. A storm is brewing, a big one. It's building quickly. He loves a good storm. Lomax stands there, letting the rain pelt him, spreading his arms, laughing loudly, like he has done so many times before. But something is different this time. He is overcome with doubt as the storm darkens and becomes more violent than he had ever experienced. Suddenly fearful, he tries to run, but his feet seem rooted in the sand. Thor, he beseeches, weakly, but in his heart he knows that no god can save him from this, not even his god. He looks down and he sees his feet buried several inches in the sand, slowly and inexorably sinking further. He can't move. The storm overtakes him. Water pools over him, covering his eyes, filling his mouth and nose, and he cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot breathe anymore. The last thing he remembers before sitting up in cold sweat is the feeling of being buried alive under a rising mound of rocks and sand as the storm rages angrily overhead. And in the storm, he sees the face of Solace. After helping Rajiv with his early morning routine, Nael and Lomax made their way to the inn. The start-of-day crowd of officers and docked merchant ships and fishermen was already mostly gone. The brute was at his usual post. He stood up and blocked the path through the back door. "No entry," he said firmly. Lomax smiled at him. "Hey, Stinky, we want to go see Brad." "No entry," Stinky repeated. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "Sorry, guys. Trina said no one through." Lomax and Nael looked at each other in surprise. "Okay, Stinky," Lomax responded. "We understand. I guess we'll come back later." They turned their heels and went outside. "What was that all about?" Nael wondered aloud. Lomax shook his head. "No idea. No point in arguing with him, though. He won't budge." Nael grunted. "So what now? If we can't see Brad, where can we go? I want to find out more about my mom. And look for our friends, too, of course." She smiled uncomfortably. "How about the library?" Lomax suggested. "Now that you know your mom is alive and connected to the Frentenga family, maybe we can find a lead there. They won't let us anywhere near the upper shelves without Garrett or a letter from Brad." "I suppose it's worth a shot," Nael responded. "I grew up in the old library at our house, and this new one is set up the same, so I know my way around it. But I read mostly about music and the Bard Zacharias. I didn't bother too much with anything else. Anyway, at least it will be something to do." The guard at the library recognized Lomax and moved aside. Then he noticed Nael, and his face lit up. "You're his daughter!" he exclaimed and pointed at the freshly installed sign behind him. "Yoros Library, in memory of a great man. He taught us to read." Nael grinned. "Yeah, it's me. How did you know?" The guard stepped in after them and pointed to the wall. Nael gasped. A family portrait hung on there, showing a man, her mother, and a younger version of herself. Underneath it, a plaque read, "Yoros and wife, perished in the fire, and daughter." "Just got put in last week, together with the sign outside," the guard said. "Looks like somebody important up on 2, he pointed upwards with a meaningful look, decided to care about this place all of a sudden. They also sent in a bunch of new stuff." He pointed towards a side room where they could see 2-wheeled carts heavily laden with books. "Hadn't been sorted yet," the guard said apologetically. "Wow," Lomax said. "That's really great. I gotta tell my dad." "Your father's Rajiv, isn't he?" the guard asked. Lomax nodded. "He was here when it all came. I think he had something to do with it." The guard seemed embarrassed. "I kind of overheard them say that Poppy sent this stuff down." "Can we check those out?" Nael asked. "Of course. You're the most important member of the library. Do as you will." The guard bowed to Nael and then went back outside. Lomax and Nael looked at each other. "I didn't expect this," she said finally. "The portrait. I remember sitting for it. I had no idea that it survived the fires." "Huh. Well, I think we deserve a bit of good news, don't you? Do you need a moment?" Nael shook her head. "Then I say, let's check those piles. If they came from up shelf, who knows what we might find." A couple of hours later, they were sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by piles of dusty tomes. "So much useless stuff," Nael said with a hint of frustration. "I guess this was less of an educational endeavor and more of a house cleaning for someone," she sighed. "Yeah," Lomax said. "I mean, it might be fascinating if you cared about council business 300 years ago." He placed the book carefully on one of the piles. "That one goes on and on about one of the caravan companies, which goods they were going to ship for which merchants." He stretched his arms and yawned. "I gotta take a break," Nael said and stood up. As she did so, she bumped into one of the piles and books scattered all over the floor. "Oops," she laughed and turned to look at Lomax. He was holding a small, mostly burnt, thin notebook. Getting up slowly, he looked at her. His face, full of care and kindness. Her heart started beating faster as he handed it to her. This fell out when you bumped the books. Check it out, he said. The letters URNAL, Ernal, could still be made across the top. Towards the bottom, somebody had scribbled a name. It was Yoros. Yoros's journal. What have I done? My grief hath no bounds. Surely a heated exchange should not lead to families losing each other forever. Yet, in this night of terror, it is precisely that which has happened. Oh, my darling wife, oh, my beautiful daughter, for 50 years I could not find the courage to tell you the truth, and now, in the anger of the moment, I have lost you forever. I can only pray that your souls find peace in heaven, while mine rots in hell for my lies and my deception. Henrielle, my love, my heart, my soul, when I saw you, I immediately knew, and when I saw your daughter, my daughter, it became a certainty. Well, it seemed like you had forgotten that long ago night in the storm when we first made love. The bond of a father with his firstborn, his only born, cannot be denied. But I could not bring myself to explain this to you, for I knew you were elven and proud, and I was a bastard and a coward. I told myself that if you knew that I was who sired the child, you would surely have left, for that was your nature. In trepidation, I approached you offering to adopt the child, to help convince you of my good intentions, as if she were not mine. When you accepted my proposal, it was the happiest moment of my life, and the decades that followed were happier still. Seeing her grow up was my greatest joy, even as I bit my tongue at seeing her searching for a father she thought she never knew. When she started worrying about why she was aging so fast, wondering if she suffered from some strange ailment, it was the hardest battle I ever fought to not speak plainly and explain that with her father's paltry human lineage, she must also have human blood, 3/4 elf. And I wanted to scream at her, Nael, my daughter, you are not short-lived for an elf. You are a bastard, a half-elf, like me. As you went to slake your thirst for adventure, even though you always kept the details of your travels from me, I knew that you would come back to me someday. This gave me reason to live like none else. Raising our daughter alone while you were gone, I tried to be as strict as you had instructed, but could not avoid spoiling her, even knowing that you would rightly be upset with me upon your return. Did you ever find what you were looking for, my love? Did you find the talisman from the war? Then, as I'd always feared, the moment finally came when you grew tired of me. Seeing the signs of age beginning to take toll on me, the vitality of your 600 years making a mockery of my pitiful 100-odd. Still, I could not bear to tell you the truth, and in my embarrassment, I screamed at you to leave. When I heard the door slam after you, my heart shattered in a million pieces. It took about an hour for me to gather my courage to call you back, but by then, it was too late. The terrors had begun. I spent day and night seeking the two of you, but with such devastation as was wrought that night, with so many dead, mounds of bodies and skulls and humanoid ashes, the conclusion was inevitable. You passed away, never knowing the truth. My daughter, my sunshine, died thinking she was sick and that she never knew her father, when in truth he was beside her, raising her for most of her life. As I sit here together with the rest of the refugees and I write this, my heart is broken and my hand is shaking. I cannot comprehend a life without you, oh my precious baby. That you died in anger because of my lies is unforgivable. But I shall repent later. I will toss myself from the overlook and into the waters below, the only fitting penance for my crime of deception. After the shock of finding Jonas' journal, they fled from the dusty tomes for the bar at the Steadfast Inn. So your adoptive father was your actual father? Lomek asked in disbelief. Nael sat down, her wineglass down carefully. Sure as I can be, it all fits, she said. To think that I lived all these years under a cloud. Lomek, I was so worried about my illness that in my head, I was already dead. Sounds painful, Lomek said. Nael sighed. Truth is, it shouldn't have mattered. I think, after that horrible night, that it became a bit of an obsession. Like, I lost everything already, you know? What did I have left? And I knew I had this mysterious disease killing me from the inside. It all made a weird kind of sense. I want to live better now. She smiled at him and leaned forward and put her hand on his. You know, Lomek, it's okay if you'd like to kiss me. You're old enough. Lomek was struck speechless. The warmth of her hand on his felt good, but his mind was in a whirl. He felt as if an invisible tentacle was suddenly clawing at his guts, trying to pull them out. He lost his vision as images of himself, first in the fighting pits, then as a rotting skeleton under a mound of dirt, then of Solace looking at him from above, floated in front of his eyes. He felt himself dry heaving. His hand jerked away and he opened his eyes. Nael was staring at him in horror. I'm sorry, he mumbled. It's not you. I like you, he said and shuddered, his mouth full of the taste of mud and his skin crawling with a million ants. She jumped up tearfully and ran outside. Lomek lowered his head in shame. Just what this mother deserves, he thought. At least it's all over.
It's getting tense.
So Act 2, Chapter 18. Prison Rat. Psst. Garrett opened his eyes. The dim light from the hallway outside glinted off the iron bars driven deeply into the volcanic rock, set with a hinged iron door. He was in what otherwise appeared like a natural cave, reinforcing the feeling of being deep underground. Psst. He was lying on a cot. As he sat up, Garrett's hand nudged a small bowl, and he felt a splash of water. He looked down and saw a second bowl with a chunk of bread and an apple. Psst. The voice was coming from the back of the cave. Who is it? He asked. Come over here, the voice said. He walked over slowly. I can't see you, he said. To your right. Look closer. He turned his head. Finally, he made out the outline of a big rat sitting in the shadows. He rubbed his eyes and squinted, but the rat was still there, looking at him patiently. What the hell? Garrett whispered. The rat spoke. Yes, it's me, and then let its tongue hang out. How am I talking to you? Can I speak to animals? Garrett frowned. What? No, silly. Even if you somehow could, animals aren't even intelligent enough to hold a conversation. It's more like I'm talking to you, the rat said. See, when I'm not a rat, I'm a gnome like you. I'm a bit plump for my species in either form, he added apologetically. When you're not a rat? Yes, surely you've heard of rare rats. Name's Carrot, by the way. Garrett. Where am I? The Shallows prison. Welcome. Carrot turned out to be especially charming for a rat. He explained that he became one as an adult following an unfortunate encounter with a dire rat in the deep caves of the inner shallows. He barely survived it, but without being bitten several times. I always thought it had to be an actual rare creature that bit you, but it turns out that it's the dire ones that carry the disease. Once you change form, the disease dies because it's no longer needed, he explained. What were you doing there? Garrett asked. Research, Carrot said. I was trying to understand the mechanism of wearing, since it doesn't seem like were creatures ever get born that way. Turns out that exposure to the bite of a dire rat, dire wolf, or dire bear has a chance of infection with the disease. It doesn't happen often. The bite is extremely toxic, so usually the bitten just dies quickly and becomes a meal. Which is what should have happened to me. But if they survive, then the transformation can occur. That's also why most were creatures are impossible to talk to. While the wearing does increase their intelligence, they still start off as animals. So what are you doing here? Garrett asked, his mind grappling with the surrealism of the moment. Oh, I found this place when I was wandering around after my initial transformation took place. It's pretty well hidden, but rats can fit through all sorts of holes. Carrot let his tongue out again, in a gesture that Garrett realized was a smile. Wait, didn't you say you were a researcher? Don't you want to tell people about your discovery? Initially, I thought so too, Carrot admitted, but when everyone just tries to kill you on sight, it's even worse if you say something to them. Couldn't you wait for when you were a gnome again? Well, yes, I could, but by then I was captivated by this place and all the stuff even deeper below, and found that being a rat was pretty useful for my research. Honestly, the 3 days when I am, well, me, they are the worst, Carrot said. Speaking of which, mind if I grab some of that food off your bowl? I need to store it for my next gnome phase, which is coming up pretty soon. Help yourself, Garrett said. I'm not hungry. Carrot came into full view. He was very large and solid, but what made him stand apart from other rats were his intelligent humanoid eyes and tiny, opposable palm hands. He grabbed the bread and quickly moved back, disappearing into a crevice before emerging back. Excellent, Carrot said. Safe and sound for later. I'll deal with the apple afterwards. Now, I tend to come by the prison a fair amount, but you're the first gnome I'd ever run across. What are you doing here? Last Garrett could recall was being taken in front of the Lavatown tribunal, where the three of them, he, Aidan, and Solace, were quickly sentenced to death for their crimes. The serious ones were murder, robbery of a designated city official, and access to restricted knowledge. The latter was clearly in reference to the flying boxes. While the murder and robbery could, on their own, be handled through a sponsor, the third was too severe for quiet intervention. They didn't have a sponsor anyway. The Thieves Guild did not acknowledge the existence of anyone in their organization by the name of Brad. For the third charge, the Maritime Guild demanded that they be put to death. We were given something to drink and all three of us passed out. Then I woke up here, Garrett finished. I can go look for the other two if you like, Garrett said. Prisoners don't usually stay around here for long, so there aren't many cells. Can you tell me their names? Aidan and Solace. You'll recognize Solace easily because she's really tall and has a collar which they put on her to stop her from doing magic, Garrett grimaced. How long do you think we have, he asked. A few days to a couple of weeks at most. The executions don't seem to be on a schedule. Somebody comes in once a day to replace the water and food bowls, and at some point, I guess they spike the water and then grab you while you're out. At least they kill you in your sleep, Garrett grinned. I'm being serious. Why are you laughing? He demanded. Never seen a rat grinning before, Garrett giggled. Oh, right. I forgot myself for a moment. It's been a while since I spoke to another gnome. So your friend is a wizard? Kinda. More like a really talented magical beacon. She's good at it, but doesn't know what she's doing most of the time, Garrett said. I'd love to know if they are here. Thanks, bud. Fair trade for the food. And anyway, now I'm curious. It's not like wizards are everywhere. To find one down here is a treat. Maybe it might be useful to my research. Garrett squeezed through the bars and disappeared down the hallway. They're here all right, he said when he came back. The wizard can't talk because of the collar, and her wrists have restraints that restrict finger movement. But she understood me, and I think she was angry. How do you know? Garrett demanded. Even with limited mobility, the signaling she used was clear enough, Garrett said. Her eyes also changed color briefly. Do all wizards do that? She's a wild mage, not a wizard, and I have no idea, Garrett responded. I think everything about her is unique. What about Aidan? Right. Different story. He didn't talk much, seemed depressed, said he was the only one that should be put to death. It wasn't fair to you and to the girl. I guess he killed somebody? Anyway, he'll get his wish soon enough. Garrett sat back on his haunches. He gave me his food, too. Garrett thought for a moment. You said you found this place when you were in the inner shallows, right? But you had to get in here, right? How? The prison doesn't have a door to the shallows, Garrett said. It doesn't? So how do they come in and out? Oh, right. There's a sort of tube that goes up through the rock and then the water. It seems like it ends up at the bottom of the docks. I climbed up partially once to check it out, but didn't want to risk my life by going through the water part, Garrett explained. So what do you do when you turn gnome? Oh, there are many natural pathways to get in and out if you're small enough, Garrett said. I don't just stay in the prison. So much to learn everywhere. Okay, so do you think there's a way for us to get out of here before they, Garrett hesitated for a moment, before they kill us? Garrett cocked his head. But aren't you criminals? Yes, I suppose we are, Garrett said, but it's not really our fault. We were misled and I think played with by people with bigger agendas. And once we were caught, it was convenient to get rid of us, he sighed. I guess that doesn't make much sense. Garrett stretched himself up to his full height. He looked at Garrett first with one eye, then the other. I never really understood all these rules anyway, he admitted. You can't squeeze through the bars, you're not small enough. Still, there is one way for you to at least go see your friends, but you're not going to like it. Oh? Garrett leaned forward. What is it? Garrett fell to his paws and scurried over to a wooden plate on the floor at the very back of the cave, before turning back and looking at Garrett. You may fit in here. Garrett walked over, lifted the plate, then immediately dropped it and scrunched his face. Ew! He exclaimed. Yeah, Garrett nodded. That's why they have the plate. It blocks the smell. Holding his nose, Garrett lifted the plate again and looked inside. It doesn't actually look that bad, he said after a moment. The hole opened onto a small tube, roughly a foot in diameter. Water was running slowly through it about a third of the way. Garrett pointed. Yes, see? Because we're so deep underground, they set this up so that water flushes things out constantly. Why doesn't the water fill up all the way? Garrett asked as he put down the plate. I'm guessing there's a flow gate where it comes in and the angle is enough that the level stays constant. It's pretty ingenious, actually, and no one must have designed it, Garrett said with obvious satisfaction. The more interesting question is where it comes out, but I haven't been able to figure it out yet. Anyway, if you want to see your friends, you're going to have to go in there and push upstream to the next cell. That's where your guy is, but Carrot stopped. But what? Well, the moment you go in, you're going to block the passage and severely restrict the flow. You'll have very little time to make it through before the pressure builds. I don't know what will happen then, but I'm sure it won't be pleasant. And if you don't get out quickly, you'll drown. Not to mention they'll be drinking shit the whole time, Garrett chuckled quietly. There's that, Carrot nodded. Sure you want to do it? I think the executions are pretty swift. I've never heard anyone scream. Sorry. Garrett jumped into the hole. The water rose to accommodate him. There goes nothing, he said, then lowered himself, letting his legs downstream. He could feel clumps hitting his back. The water was now rushing around him, moving higher and faster than before. The stench was nauseating. Garrett took a deep breath and closed his mouth. He would give the rest of his memories to forget the next minute of his life. The stream covered his head almost immediately, and he pushed slowly against the increasing pressure. The walls were slick with grime, and even though he wasn't trying to breathe, his biggest challenge quickly became to keep himself from gagging. His nostrils and ears filled with refuse-laden water. He could feel soft material cling to his pores. He kept his eyes shut tightly as he felt his way, seeking the next hole up. The tunnel was filling up quickly, and the pressure was inhibiting his progress. When his fingers finally found the bottom of the wooden plate, the tube had filled with sewage. He pushed against it and pulled himself up as quickly as he could. It was the second time in a short while that he felt like a cork being pulled out of a bottle. You made it, Carrot announced as soon as he opened his eyes. Well done. I'll admit I was curious to see what would happen if you didn't. Garrett breathed carefully through the corner of his mouth and wiped his face, which improved nothing. He blew out his nose loudly into the open hole and turned his head. Aidan was standing there looking at him in shock. Oh, hi, Aidan. Thought I'd come and see you, Garrett quipped. What? How? Aidan blurted. Took the smelly route to pay you a visit. Carrot here tells me you're depressed. Figured you'd like his friendly face, Garrett smiled. Look, Aidan, I've only known you for a short while, but that doesn't sound like the guy who saved my ass at Stormbridge. So, want to figure out how to get out of here? Aidan nodded, dumbfounded. Cool. Let me go check on Solace and see if I can help her out of that muzzle. Solace looked dispassionately at the slime-covered Garrett as he emerged from the hole. She was sitting against the wall, her arms at her side, her fingers twitching slightly against the restraints. He walked over to her, his eyes twinkling. So what have we here? He asked, and leaned closer to look at her collar. She winced at the smell. Yeah, sorry, I'm covered in shit. Maybe even some of yours, he said as he touched the device. It whirred slightly, and Solace groaned in pain. Oops, sorry, he said, then bent down to examine her hands. He rose up. Look, Solace, I don't know anything about magic, but the wrist guards look normal to me. Very well made, and they're locked, and they're trapped, but not, magical. Unlike this thing, he said as he pointed at her neck. Do you want me to try and undo them? Just like blink twice for yes. She blinked twice. Okie dokie, he said. Several minutes passed as Garrett fiddled carefully with the bindings, swearing several times along the way. Suddenly, his head jerked backwards. A tiny needle whizzed by his ear and lodged into the wall behind him. Well, that took care of that, he said with satisfaction. A few seconds later, he stood up, holding a complex-looking glove in his hand. That's one, he announced. Solace slowly brought her hand up, wriggling her fingers. She gestured for Garrett to step back. Carrot ran quickly to the door and slipped through the bars before turning back to watch. They could see Solace tracing a faint magical sigil through the air. Then the sigil faded, its energy seemingly sucked into her index finger. She moved it slowly towards her neck. As the memory of the shockwave flashed through his mind, Garrett involuntarily closed his eyes. He heard a loud click. You okay there, Garrett? Garrett opened his eyes. The collar was on the floor next to Solace, split in half. Want to help me with the other glove? I'm afraid I can't do it with magic. It needs a burglar, Solace smiled. A few moments later, the glove was off, and another needle had struck the wall. I worked with these kinds of gloves as part of my training, Garrett stood back. The needles are no joke. In training, they just coat them with an irritant, but usually it's lethal poison. He gestured at the broken collar. I saw they put that thing on you when they arrested us. Does it stop magic? Solace nodded. Worse, it stops me from talking or even moving my head too much. Wizards usually need to say something to do something. A head gesture might also be required. Turns out I can skip those parts for shock magic. Just need my hands. I think it's because it was my first one. It's in my blood. It's always present. Once you took off that glove, I used the shock on the collar. Could have killed me, I suppose, she added casually. Garrett hugged her knees. I'm so glad you're alive, he said. Me too, but in the name of the gods, move away. You stink, she responded. Garrett stepped back. Yeah, I do, he giggled. Listen, can you use this to open the door? Probably, Solace said. Can't hurt to try. She traced another magical sigil before placing her hand on the metal bars. The entire doorway shone briefly, and they could hear the metal snap. The door opened quietly. I swear this whole place smells like magic, she muttered. What did you say? Garrett asked. This whole place smells like magic, she repeated. It's in the background. I can sense it. Hell, I can practically taste it. It's wonderful. Anyway, want to go get Aiden? I would normally be getting a little tired now, but it seems like my power is growing. Maybe it's the ambient magic. Should be no trouble forcing open another door. Yeah, let's go, Garrett said. They turned their heads toward Carrot, who had come back into the room. That was a neat trick and all. I'm definitely going to add it to my notes when I can write again. You don't mind if I take the collar, right? Good for research. They shook their heads. As Carrot picked up one of the bits, he turned to them and said, You know, that thing you said about it smelling like magic, I think I know the source of it. Solace glared at the big rat. Excuse me, she demanded. Yes, there is lots of cool stuff down in the deeps, but the coolest, paws down, is the big stopper. The what? They exclaimed. The big stopper. Well, I don't know what they call it up top, but it's the thing that keeps the volcano from killing everyone. I think it's the reason this place exists. The prison came later. Lomek sat staring for a long while after Nael left, dried up tears covering his cheeks. He vaguely remembered filling his cup a few times when it became depleted. He was therefore, he admitted, in a somewhat inebriated state when he felt it. A surge of adrenaline flooded his body. He tried standing up. Oof, he exclaimed and sat back down quickly, wincing in pain as his head swam. He took several deep breaths, then tried again, more slowly this time. The room wobbled, and he stabilized it by holding onto the table. Unfortunately, the table unexpectedly decided to move, and he crashed loudly onto the floor. Nael, he murmured weakly. Then he remembered that she left, even if he couldn't recall why exactly. He could feel a hand touching his shoulder and hit back at it, but his arm developed a life of its own and ended up swiping at the empty air instead. The invisible hand was joined by another. They moved under his armpits, and he tried to push them away, but only ended up slapping himself. Nihil, he repeated, as he was hoisted up to his feet. Take him outside, someone said. The voice vaguely sounded like it belonged to someone he knew. Those dang invisible hands were distracting him as they half lifted, half dragged him in the direction of the door. Then he remembered. Trina, he asked. You've had a bit too much, Lomek, he could hear the familiar voice saying. Don't worry, Stinky will take care of you, but you need some fresh air. He liked the voice and beamed proudly at his accurate recollection of the speaker's name. As the disembodied hands carried him outside, he could feel the crisp evening air and breathed in deeply. Then he passed out. Sometime later, he woke up, his temples throbbing mightily. The sun was well past its zenith, and the air was cool and fresh. At least the ground isn't moving anymore, he thought. Then he realized that the feeling was still present, and a warm, pleasant glow spread from his gut all over his body. He smiled and closed his eyes. I'm so happy you're alive. Lomek, go away, he mumbled, and tried to turn away. Instead, he found himself falling down and his face hit the ground. Ow, he exclaimed and sat up, rubbing his chin. Nael was standing over him, her arms crossed. The last rays of the setting sun were mingling with the lights of Kuri and Ani, making it seem as if she had an aura. So, she asked. So what, he croaked. Why did you call for me? They found me and told me that you kept saying my name, she responded coolly. He stood shakily on his feet. I'm really thirsty, he said. She didn't move. He shook his head gingerly, worried that it might start pounding again, and took a deep breath. She's alive, Nael. Who is alive? Solace. Nael's face lit up. Wait, you mean you can feel her again? She said excitedly. He nodded. Can I please have some water? Nael took off her water skin and handed it to him. Here, I just filled it. When did this happen? He accepted the water gratefully and took a long drink. A little while ago, she just popped back into my consciousness. I don't know what it means, but she's alive. Oh, and Nael? Yes? How I reacted, earlier? Don't worry about it. I made a mistake. It was my fault, she said with an edge to her voice. No, you don't understand. It wasn't what you said at all. It's just that, when you said it, I was having a vision. A vision? Her voice softened. Yes, an ugly one. I was drowning and then I was covered in ants and my mouth was full of sand. I'm really sorry. It wasn't about you, I promise. I really like you too. Oh, she said. Then after a moment, she leaned in and closed her arm over his shoulders. Come on, let's get you back inside. It's getting chilly and I think you need to eat something. The rest of the cells are empty, Ada noted. Yeah, I guess 6 is plenty when nobody stays down here for long, Sully said. Come check this out. This must be where they get you to talk. She pointed into a slightly larger cave. In it were set out a number of torturing devices, including an iron maiden, a breaking wheel, thumb screws, and flaying apparatus, amongst others. Aidan shuddered. Even Garrett refrained from expressing his customary enthusiasm. Do they kill you in there too? Garrett asked. Garrett said he never heard anybody scream, which is weird considering, he said, and made a sweeping gesture at the room. Let me check something out, Sully said, and stepped into the torture cave. As she crossed the threshold, the sound of her footsteps disappeared. She turned to look at them and said something. Aidan shook his head and pointed at his ear, and Sully stepped back out. Just as I thought. They have a sound barrier on the doorway. Cool magic, actually. I'll have to try and replicate it sometime. Let's make our way out of here before one of us ends up on the wrong side of it, Aidan said nervously, and pointed down the corridor. Garrett said the tube's over there. They rounded the corner and came across a circular area. There was a small table with a step stool next to it. Above, a large round opening beckoned. That must be the tunnel, Garrett pointed. Let's check it out, Aidan said and climbed up on the table. He peered into the hole and ducked back down. Yep, it kind of spirals up and away. Pretty steep, but there's iron rungs every couple of feet. Solis, can you listen and let us know if anybody's coming down? Solis nodded, then concentrated for a few moments. Far as I can tell, the coast is clear. Alrighty then, let's do this, Aidan said and hoisted himself upwards, disappearing into the hole. Thank you, Nael, Lomek sighed and pushed away his plate. I needed that. My head isn't pounding anymore. Nael smiled. Wait, well, to be honest, I'd never seen a dwarf drunk before. I didn't think it was possible. He felt his cheeks flush. So tell me, if you can feel Solis again, do you have a sense of where she might be? Lomek closed his eyes for a few seconds. Yeah, I think so, but it makes no sense. How do you mean? Nael asked. Well, it feels like she's below us. Below us? Like in the water? I guess, yeah, and it's not very close either. But she's alive, clearly, not drowned? Oh, no, Lomek said firmly. She's definitely alive. The tunnel winded its way through the inside of the volcano. Aidan couldn't help but think that there was a natural pathway laid within the mountain, and that whoever created the tunnel followed it closely. He found himself daydreaming as he touched the smooth walls over and over again, wondering if rock could speak like wood. Suddenly, it did. Solis, we know you're down there. We're trying to figure things out, it said. Aidan stopped and jerked his hand back. Did you guys hear that? He asked. Hear what? Solis asked from above. Garrett, who was below him, added, Not me. What was it? The wall just talked to me, Aidan said. A moment passed in silence, then Solis spoke. Like wood, right? What did it say? Aidan looked up at her and repeated the message. Then he added, I was feeling the rock and it happened. A little different than I'm used to, but my hand had no trouble making out the words. That's gotta be Nael, Solis responded. Looks like they haven't given up on us. That's nice. Any way to send them back a message? Aidan wondered. No, I can't do what she does. I can only listen, Solis shook her head. How about a shockwave? Garrett asked from below. Huh? Solis responded. What do you mean? Well, Garrett said, a shockwave is a wave, right? And like Nael told us, so is sound. So maybe you can send a shockwave of sound to the rock and the water? Solis blinked, then shrugged her shoulders. She started moving her fingers in a complicated pattern, forming another faint sigil, and which wrapped itself around her wrist. Then she touched the rung above her. I sent it, Nael said, straight down, like you said. But Lomek, other than back in Koranta City, I haven't tried to do anything like this. I used to have to see who I'm talking to and even know them a little. And now I'm trying to make my voice travel blindly through stone. You get that it's weird, right? I'm not even sure what I'm doing is right. Well, it can't hurt. Can you try a few more times? Just kind of spread it around a bit, go higher and lower. Sure, Nael sighed. And then can we go to bed, please? It's been an exhausting day. These projections were a strange sensation. It felt like she was bouncing a random sound off a surface, pushing it further, amplifying it within itself to propel it forward through water and volcanic rock underneath the inn. Nothing happened. All right, I'm done. She stood up. Let's go. Lomek held his hand up. Just give it a moment, okay? They waited quietly for a few seconds. Lomek pushed himself slowly out of his chair. Oh, well, he said. Thank you, Nael. It was worth a shot. In that instant, a strange sound permeated the atmosphere. It was barely audible, a quiet whisper emerging from below, and it rose rapidly up towards the ceiling. All the lights in the bar flickered. They looked at each other. That felt, Lomek stated, just like the echo of a shockwave. Yes, I agree, Nael grinned broadly. I guess she did hear us after all. The three of them finally reached the top of the tunnel. It opened into a small flat area. They climbed onto the surface and stood up. Will you look at that? They heard somebody speak and turn around to see two men come out of another tunnel with crossbows at the ready. What have we here? A prison escape? One of the men was saying. That's a new one. Have you ever heard of someone escaping the prison? Nope, said the other man. Definitely a new one. I wonder how they got out of their cells. Then he turned to them and said, we do appreciate your letting us know you're coming through. Whatever it is you did came through very clearly. The other men moved a bit to the side. Aidan noticed that the guards were holding dual crossbows that shot 2 arrows. Now, do us all a favor and sit down on your knees with your hands in the air. I really don't want to kill you right now, but seeing where you just came from, it was going to happen anyway. And we really are excellent shots, both of us. He chuckled. I just don't feel like cleaning up a mess. The three of them exchanged glances. Solace nodded at them slightly, a twinkle in her eye, and sank slowly to her knees. Aidan and Garrett copied her movement, and they all started raising their arms. With her fingers playing an air tune, 2 large flaming darts suddenly materialized right in front of Solace's hands. The guards' eyes opened wide, but they never even had time to pull their triggers, as the ghostly arrows buried themselves squarely in their chests. They dropped to the ground, and their screams of agony echoed around the walls of the small chamber as they died from a fire that consumed them from the inside. Aidan looked at her in awe. Remind me to never piss you off, ever, he said as he clapped her on the back. Garrett was already running. Let's check it out, he yelled as he disappeared down the tunnel from which the 2 guards had emerged. Aidan went over to examine the bodies. He picked up one of the crossbows and turned it over in his hands. Pretty good, he said appreciatively, although I can definitely make some improvements. Take one if you want, but our priority is to get out of here alive, Solace reminded him. Anything on them that we might be able to use? Aidan put the crossbow down just as Garrett came back holding an apple. It's a storeroom, he took a bite, chewing noisily. We should check this other tunnel. What you doing? I was thinking we might search for keys, Aidan responded. Garrett knelt down next to him. Here, let me, he said. His hands worked rapidly as coins and other small items of value disappeared quickly into his pockets, while he tossed aside useless odds and ends. Well, this might be interesting, the gnome stood up. Never seen anything like it before. The wooden object was a bit larger than his palm and was shaped like a hexagon. A hole in the center was framed with a thin metal and looked very much like a mouth. I think it's the same material that's on the flying boxes, he said meaningfully, as his finger traced the metal outline. Solace reached out her hand. Can I see it? She took it and examined it slowly, then held it up and inhaled deeply. That's very nice, she giggled, and her face softened. Aidan and Garrett looked at each other in surprise. They could see her pupils dilating. Guys, you can't go in there. Really, Trina came to stand behind them, her hands on her hips. But why, Trina? We were supposed to meet with Brad, but Stinky wouldn't let us through. What's going on? I don't rightly know, Lomek, but I don't have this job for being nosy. And if Bavin tells me to stay out and keep everyone else out too, then that's what I'm going to do, she responded. So Bavin said not to allow anyone in, Nael asked. Can I talk to him? He knows me. Said the bartender. Nael, you know I adore you and I miss you singing up here. You always make the patrons spend more money. Tell you what, she smiled. I'll talk to him and make sure he gives you an audience first thing in the morning. Nael nodded. That's fair. Thank you, Trina. She started walking towards the stairs to the 2nd floor, but then stopped and turned around. One thing though, if our really tall friend shows up, can you send her up to our room? You got it, Trina smiled. Now go and get some rest and be down here bright and early. I'll make sure there's breakfast ready. The other tunnel ran for a bit before terminating at a door made of smooth stone without visible hinges. Garrett inspected it. Wow, that's clever, he said and pointed to the wall. See here? The door actually slides into the wall. But how do you open it? Aidan asked. Well, that might have something to do with it. Garrett pointed at the outline of a slight hexagonal depression set in the wall. Solace took out the wooden piece they found and held it near. Looks like it would fit, you know, that she nodded. Then she stood up. It must be some sort of key, but before we shove it in there, let me listen. A moment passed and she spoke again. I have good news and bad news, she said. What's the good news? Aidan asked. There isn't anybody on the other side, Solace answered. And the bad? It's because what's on the other side is water. If we open this door, I suspect the whole place will flood and we will drown. That makes no sense, Aidan said. This has to be how they get in and out of here. I don't buy it. They stood there in silence. Then Garrett took the device and examined it more closely. What do you think the mouth hole is for? He asked and tried shoving his finger in the center. The mouth snapped shut. Ow! He cried and pulled his finger out with a bit of effort. It came out bloody. The mouth opened fully again. God damn it, he swore. I'm so sick of my fingers being chopped off. Barely suppressing a laugh, Aidan took the device and before Solace could stop him, tried fitting it into the depression. It fit perfectly. Then it got pulled in tighter and they could hear a loud click. A hidden door slid silently to shut off the tunnel behind them. The mouth in the center snapped shut, then opened slowly, repeating the movement every few seconds. Did we miss something back there? Solace looked at Garrett, whose face developed a nice shade of crimson. He said, I'm sorry, guys. I think I know what fits in the hole. Yes? Solace crossed her arms. Well, you see, remember I was searching the bodies? One of them had a few bits of wood in his pocket. Looked like he was a bit of a carver. I kept his folding knife, but sort of discarded the rest, Garrett said. And? Well, one of them didn't seem like anything in particular. I took a good look at it, but just figured it was something he's just started working on, so I tossed it away. Garrett looked up. Now I think it might have been the thing that fits in there. He pointed at the mouth hole. I'm really sorry, he said helplessly. Great. So now we're well and truly stuck, Solace said. We can't go back and we can't go forward. I guess we'll just wait here until they find us. She sat down heavily and rested her head on her knees. Hey, Garrett, do you remember what the wooden piece looked like? Aidan asked. More or less, yes, Garrett answered. Why? Just give me as much detail as you can, Aidan said. As Garrett did his best to describe the piece, Aidan held the dual crossbow he had brought with him. After a minute, they could hear something snap, and the weapon broke apart, falling to the floor. But when Aidan opened his palm, they could see he now held a wooden peg that matched Garrett's description. I make better bows, Aidan smiled. He stood up and looked at the others. Ready? He inserted the peg. They held their breath as the mouth snapped down. A second or two passed, and then the mouth slowly opened again, and the peg fell out of it. Aidan picked it up and tried again, but the same thing happened. Looks like it's not a perfect fit, Garrett, who was standing on his toes and looking at the device closely, said. Right, Aidan said. He gently nudged Garrett and held one hand to the wooden frame. He inserted the peg carefully for the third time and closed his eyes. The mouth snapped shut, but this time, as Aidan's fingers made tiny movements against the device, they could see that instead of slowly opening back, it stayed shut, and its contours shifted ever so slightly. They heard another loud click. Aidan stood up and stepped back. The device rotated into the wall, and they could feel the air pressure begin to drop. Oh, take a deep breath, both of you, and hold it in. Don't speak. Now, Solace exclaimed, then took a deep breath herself. As they did, they could suddenly hear the sound of water moving behind the door. A few seconds later, it slid open quietly. Behind it was a small tube leading straight up with rungs set to one side as a ladder. It was all wet inside and water was dripping off the walls. But what made it truly remarkable was that the tube was transparent. They were some distance under the surface of the water inside the volcano's core. They could see fish and algae moving about. It was as if they were inside a giant aquarium. Garrett opened his mouth. It's so beautiful, he said, his voice sounding flat and barely audible. Then he closed it again, a look of fear coming onto his face. He pointed at his chest. Aidan grabbed him and placed him high on the ladder, and Garrett scrambled upwards with the other two following closely behind. At the top, they moved onto another corridor. Garrett collapsed on the floor, opening and closing his mouth. Aidan smacked the wall. They heard a click, and a door shut behind them to seal off the aquarium tube. Then the sound of flushing water could be heard, and they could feel air flowing into the little chamber. A similar looking device to the one they used below rotated onto the wall, and they clicked and then clicked and ejected slightly. Another door slid open quietly ahead of them. Garrett gasped, breathed in deeply, and started coughing. I told you not to speak, you idiot, Solly said. It was a low-pressure chamber, definitely of gnomish design, ingenious, filled with water unless it needs to be crossed. Looks like a good way of making sure that whatever needs to stay in there stays in there. Aidan reached towards the key device. Solly stopped him. No, I say leave it. I'm sure they have others, but it will be more confusing for them when they find it this way. She pointed forward. Looks like we're under the inn. Let's see where this comes out. A short while later, they reached a vertical tube inside the bedrock. At the top was a circular hatch with a handle set in a groove along the outer edge. Aidan climbed up and tried pushing. Then he slid the handle and tried again. The hatch opened quietly. They climbed into the room above. It was the one where Brad had recruited them to the guild, and it was completely destroyed.
A lot more action.
What?
A lot more action.
Yeah, I told you it's picking up the pace, right?
Yeah.
Promised. You also encountered like I said, my favorite minor character. I just love Carrot. Yeah, Greg. Of course, what I was suggesting you might want to punch me is when Lomic turned out to perhaps be child.
Yeah, I'm glad it was exact. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. I'm actually heartened and glad that the little kid's not dead.
So this is like the whole
Yeah.
experience was ruined.
So it's completely the opposite reaction what you thought. I'm happy about this.
Can't stop thinking about. Yeah, I'm surprised when you introduced Carrot and said he was a were rat, you didn't instinctively say bear rat.
I don't know. I love Carrot. Carrot's guy.
But dire wolf, like in Game of Thrones, dire wolf.
No, so there's two types of creatures. There's dire creatures, which are basically, you think of them as rabid animals, right? But in the sense of, the disease they have as rabid animals is that they convey the disease of wearism.
Oh, okay.
Right. That's because one of the things that people never you think about werewolves in common mythology. It's like it's very hand wavy. It's like, how does this happen? What happens over time? How how do you there's nobody's ever. So this is one of those areas where I'm like, what? Screw that. I'm gonna fix this thing because it bugs me about how werewolves or were creatures generally are created. And so this is the mechanism they're created in this world, and it also explains why werewolf in the werewolf chapter wasn't at human intelligence, more intelligent than an animal, but not quite as intelligent as a human, right?
Right.
It increased intelligence, but
It increased a little bit, but if you end up somehow getting the disease when you're already a full-grown adult, you maintain you carry the intelligence with you into your werewolf state, and so it allows you to be a much more interesting were creature, right?
Yeah.
So there's now there's a reasoning behind this. There's a way that this all works. That's at least makes some internal sense.
Okay.
But I think I mentioned it early on that I'm trying to fix some of the things that have always bugged me about various fantasy tropes, things that people do, and this is just one of them.
Okay.
One of the many.
There's a number, right? I mean, the whole issue of what happens when you have and then another example in here, right? You have a dwarven child being adopted by a human father, right? What does that mean? Well, of course, the child never thinks about the fact that his parent is going to die much quicker than he would expect, right? Because so there's all these things we never talk about them. What happens when from societally when that happens, right? So we're touching on a lot of these little things that usually are just very hand wavy in fantasy. For me, I don't that stuff really bugs me. So
Yeah.
okay with
A couple of things that came to mind, and I got to say them before I forget. one of actually I wrote down one of them because it was such a detail that I thought was so cool. I think it was Lormac when he was getting up and the dialogue or the words said he got up and he said, "Oof," he explained. So, because and then like oof was and that's all you needed to know. It was a struggle for him to get up. And for you to use the words he explained, it's like, yes, he just made that noise because it's hard for him to get up or whatever it was. And that was cool. More of that would be Barakism, because that's what one of the uniquenesses is that it's setting this kind of apart. And the other one was I was surprised that Niall could manipulate the notes from somebody else's creativity.
Did you like that part, the description of that though? Because that was very much for you, my friend.
Action was cool. I'm not sure how I feel about the fact she can do it. That she can't just manipulate stuff she did, but she can manipulate notes coming from other people who aren't so good and make them better. I like that idea, but I'm still, I guess, getting my head around that she can do it for somebody else's creativity.
So I do want to tell you, because this is true for all of them, they're all discovering their real nature, right? I mean, this part of the story is the self-discovery and what they really are and who they really are.
Yep.
This is just another step in Niall's journey. When she discovers in the next reading, you'll figure this out, right? What she, when she discovers what she truly is, this will you will remember this conversation because it's an important step on that journey.
Well, she's my favorite. And so when I was, thinking when you first had talked about, this character can manipulate notes individually for the hearers, I was like, wow, I wish I could do that because I suck. And but now that she can do it for other people too, that's quite a step function in power. I mean, in influence, that's like an order of magnitude or
It is.
two,
Yep.
more powerful.
And in chapter 22, which is going to be the third one I read next time, it will all click in and make sense in a completely new way.
It's making sense fine this way.
I'm saying it's going to flip. Everything is going to start flipping.
Am I misremembering, or now when they were fighting the werewolf, she manipulated some.
Right. She learned more skills, right?
Yeah.
So she was
Yeah,
like, now she
the
could.
first time she manipulated another sound. Not
Correct.
her.
Well, the first time was when they were walking down the street and she took the sound of the steps that they were walking on the street on the cobblestones and she kind of smacked it, right?
Yeah, but that's
So she's developing. Clearly, she's developing her powers. She doesn't.
Oh, that's right.
Solace is developing her powers,
Also another
right?
conversation that she was amplifying a conversation that she was.
I can't see Idon. I cannot see Idon. There he is.
Yeah, so they're all developing their powers. They're all learning new things about what they can and cannot do.
Yeah.
Except Garrett, who's just funnier.
Yeah.
Essentially. Did you enjoy the little trip through the sewer?
Okay. So the two, like the
We need airline bags here.
I mean, I actually felt the chunks hitting my back.
Oh, good. So the description was good.
Yeah, but it did.
You get to sleep on the couch then.
Yeah.
Poor Garrett.
He didn't seem to mind at all, by the way. He
Yeah.
was completely
I
unaffected.
know,
by
because
it.
he's
like, oh
it's
yeah, I guess I
Garrett.
stink. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's Garrett, right?
Yeah.
If there's somebody in this
Lucky.
group that had to go through this, might as well be him. But he's small enough, right? Nobody else could do it, right? He's a tiny little creature, right?
Yeah.
So he can just
So
about
it was
fit
like
into
a
the.
foot.
Yeah, right, but he's 3 feet tall, right? He's tiny.
How did you fit in 1 foot?
Not
Well,
standing up. If he lies down,
yeah.
he can. You can't, but he
Yeah.
can. Just about.
Yeah. So small. Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to visualize this group together as a visual. It's like, oh wow, really all mismatched. Like,
Absolutely. That's what makes them so interesting, I think, right?
One of the things that
cover
makes them-
art for the book is going to be helpful in this.
Probably. I mean, I actually have so interesting thing. I have a legit young adult, like a kid who's 19 years old, who's reading the manuscript and really excited by it. And he's an artist. And he's like, can I draw the characters? I'm like, sure. So can't wait to see what he comes up with. I love his art style, it's really cool. I've seen a whole bunch of his comics. So
Nice.
at some point we may get a visual.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you share, because I
Of
think
course I
that,
will share. Are you
Well,
kidding me?
that's another option is,
I think that would be cool.
graphic novel.
So our heroes have escaped from prison and found mysterious things going on with the volcano. And a were creature, not the one we thought, but a were creature has joined the group. All right. What will happen next? That's my outro, I guess.
The like and subscribe, right?
Okay.